A long time ago, in a decade that seems far, far away, there was a classic game from a beloved Japanese video game franchise that captured the imaginations of millions of young, impressionable gamers. That classic, Final Fantasy VII, was a formative and emotional experience for many a youth in the 90s. Fast forward an odd 20 years, and those youths are no longer boys and girls, but grown men and women, fathers and mothers, with jobs and disillusions and lives more grounded in the day-to-day grind of reality than in the dreams and, dare I say, fantasies of their more whimsical youth. But the passion that classic game inspired hasn't seemed to fade like so much else from adolescence. If anything, the excitement that surrounded the announcement of a Final Fantasy VII Remake in 2015 was higher than any other video game remake I'd seen before. A testament to the impact the characters and story had on an entire generation. The anticipation around the announcement nearly reached hysteria. But not for me. I was superior to these plebeian reactionaries because I felt like I was seeing things more clearly than everyone else, and I attributed my aloof superiority to two reasons. The first was because I felt as if I was on the outside looking in. After all, I didn't have the trademarked Final Fantasy VII nostalgia glasses that everyone else seemed to wear. I've played Final Fantasy VII, but not when it was released in the 90s. Not during my adolescent years, but much later in life, while looking at the game with a more objective and detached attitude than the enthusiasm one might expect from a teenager diving into the latest and greatest game to arrive on the scene in a decade. Playing it later in life, without the pervasive nostalgia that obscures its true quality, convinced me that, while it is a fantastic game and deserving of its classic status, is far from perfect and far from even the best Final Fantasy. The second reason I felt like I was seeing this remake enthusiasm more clearly than the exuberant masses was because I have a healthy and, to my mind, wise skepticism of reboots, remakes, and the milking of beloved franchises in general, brought about by a near endless string of painful experience.
It's a sin! It's a sin!
Why was everyone so excited at the prospect of a Final Fantasy VII Remake? It seemed clear to me that, like any number of prior examples, the amorphous they were just going to burn down yet another beloved IP for quick profit, retconning problematic moments from the original story for journalist brownie points, while shoehorning new, virtuous updates to the story in the form of diversity quotas and ham-fisted social justice diatribes.
You've got to do better, Senator.
So I had an aloof and obviously much better view of this remake than the raving Final Fantasy VII fanboys. I had an objective view of the original game, and I had the entertainment industry figured out. So, for these reasons, I ignored the Final Fantasy VII Remake for years after its release in April 2020. It was, after all, just nostalgia bait garbage. And, if you haven't figured it out yet, I was completely and totally wrong. Having just picked up and played the remake in the last couple months, it turns out that I'm not better than the fanboys, and I could actually stand to learn a lot from them. Maybe it's time I tried out that unrestrained enthusiasm for something again. The Final Fantasy VII Remake was worth the wait, and then some. Don't get me wrong, this is not a perfect game either, and we'll cover the bad, but allow me to just rave for a while about how much I loved this game. First of all, and this is big for me, the Final Fantasy VII Remake was clearly made by people who understand, love, and respect the original. It's important that I point out that this is not a remake so much as a reboot of the original story, almost like an alternate timeline, which I'm not sure I like, and we'll talk about that, but it doesn't need to be, and probably shouldn't be, a one-to-one copy to be a good game and respectful homage. The game developers clearly know these characters, this world, and the themes of the story inside and out, which is a refreshing divergence from the string of garbage franchise remakes made by people uninterested or even downright despising of the IPs they reboot, who seem to revitalize beloved stories only for profit, and sometimes to even try to tear down the original itself. That doesn't happen here. All the characters and events are handled in a way that shows passion, both for what they were in 1997 and what they could be if expanded upon even further. And that's a good aspect to address. This game expands a ton upon everything in the original game, almost exclusively in ways that feel organic and in line with Final Fantasy VII's world, established lore and character personalities, while also branching thoughtfully into new, unaddressed areas in world building and character development. This is all made possible by the fact that what they've done is convert perhaps only a quarter, literally just the very beginning of the original game, into the remake, expanding upon it into a fully fleshed out story all its own, which allowed them to explore Midgar more in-depth across nearly every aspect. Settings, characters, factions. It's both welcome and very well done, making everything feel more multidimensional and real than even the original, which is quite the feat. This all ended up working wonderfully, allowing them to address the threat of Shinra for an entire game, and really anchor it in people's minds. It also allowed them to address something that was in dire need of being addressed in the original game, yet never got any screen time. I remember playing Final Fantasy VII for the first time, feeling kind of uneasy about what I was doing as Cloud Strife, aiding eco-terrorists in committing actual acts of terrorism that resulted in the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians. All I could think about for perhaps the first 5 hours I played the game was,
are we the baddies?
This doesn't really ever get addressed in the original game, but for like one line toward the end where Barrett says something akin to, yeah, maybe we probably shouldn't have done that. I kind of feel bad about it. And then it's never talked about again. But here in the remake, thank God, they actually have all these characters struggle with guilt about what they're doing. Well, to lesser or greater extents. This dude is straight up still just an unapologetic douchebag. I make no bones about the fact that I detest Barrett. Didn't like him in the original game, don't like him in the remake. His personality is just 180 degrees opposite mine. Like, what an arrogant asshole. Cannot stand it. But the struggle is very welcome in their character arcs, especially in Biggs, Jesse, and Tifa's, all of whom are very kind, compassionate people who would absolutely have major issue with killing innocent people for any cause, no matter how righteous it seems. Seeing them come to grips with it all made Midgar and these characters feel more real compared to the original, where it yanked me out of the story quite badly that none of these characters were troubled by this. And let's be honest, these character designs are spot on, matching the hyper-stylized look and feel of the original characters while somehow still managing to feel real. Tifa feels like the down-home girl next door who's learned to kick ass and take names when she must. Aerith feels like a mysterious, spiritual soul wise beyond her youthful, playful exterior. Barrett feels like an arrogant asshat that... Sorry. Barrett feels like a self-assured, passionate fighter for a cause. Biggs feels like a soft-spoken, compassionate man trying to do what's right for the people around him. Cloud feels like a bitter, disillusioned veteran of a horrible war. You all get the picture. All this was achieved as much by the character designs as by the fantastic voice acting and excellent dialogue. There's just, overall, a lot of moving pieces here that had to be handled carefully to come together into a cohesive whole. And it did. Something that was no doubt helped along by the mind-blowing character animation. I mean, look at how everything from expressions to subtle movement feels natural. I'm not one to care too much about high-budget visuals, but damn, credit where it's due. Now, all this gushing on my part is starting to make me sound like a 12-year-old girl who just discovered her first crush.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
So I'll cease singing the remake's praises long enough to talk about the combat system, something that could be a pro or con depending on your point of view and preference for game style. The developers decided to go with a gameplay style very similar to the Final Fantasy XIII games, which, I'll be honest, is not my brand of scotch. The Final Fantasy XIII system, with its stagger break bars and active time battle gauges, is probably my least favorite system in the Final Fantasy franchise, so I wasn't thrilled with the developer's gameplay choices. However, this basically comes down to preference, because I tend to enjoy more strategic, tactical style games and less actiony stuff. But there are a lot of gamers out there that love action games, and if that's what you like, then you'll enjoy how streamlined and fast-paced the gameplay is, dropping a lot of tedious, repetitive elements that plagued the original's turn-based line battles. Now, all the raving on my part has no doubt given off the false impression that this was a perfect experience. While this is a wonderful game that deserves all the praise it gets, I don't want to give the impression that this is the messiah of video games, come down to save the souls of games everywhere and show them the path to enlightenment. There are quite a few areas in which the remake stumbles, with a lot of inane fetch quests, filler levels that hurt the plot's pacing, retarded puzzle levels that serve literally no purpose, and a really dumb enemy AI that allows you to cheese the whole game by forcing it to target who you want. The biggest problem is, oddly enough, in the context of plot. I stated it earlier that this game was clearly made by people who understood, love, and respect the original, which makes the divergence from the original plotline even more baffling than if it had been made in a vacuum. I won't go into details for spoiler reasons, but suffice it to say, the divergence made from the original plot at the end of the game, while foreshadowed a bit with the inclusion of the weird Fate Guardians, makes very little sense in either the context of the overall OG storyline or this new iteration's plot. It actually kind of wrecks a lot of the character motivations that have been developed for the past 50 hours of gameplay. It's also wildly different in tone and style than the rest of the game, and I can't help but wonder if there was a lot of pressure from executives for the climax to include destruction of the universe level stakes, despite the grounded plot not really warranting something that over the top. The whole game revolves around the Shinra plot, particularly stopping the slow, gradual exploitation of the planet's life force and unraveling the scheme to start a new large-scale war. These are definitely big enough stakes for the climax of the game. We don't need an immediate world-ending threat to cap off the story of a scrappy resistance movement. The story should eventually get to that level of threat, but moving it this far forward and in the context of the game that was made is simply a baffling story choice from a team that, up until the conclusion, had made almost all the right calls. Hopefully, the severe wrenches this throws into the well-built story plot and character developments will get smoothed out in the next game, because that massive slip-up has the potential to throw everything off the rails. But I have high hopes going forward, because despite that mistake and the few other gameplay and pacing issues I mentioned, this is a really solid game, a worthy homage to a beloved classic, and the beginning of what could be a new masterpiece very much its own. I enjoyed myself immensely, ate a large amount of humble pie for my pessimism, and loved every bite of it.
So good and tasty?
If you loved the original game, you're going to feel like you've gone home when you step into Midgar again. It feels the same as the original, just easier to see, hear, taste, and experience because of the gorgeous new cinematography and animation. If you're a newcomer, don't worry, this game has all the hallmarks that made the original a classic, as well as updates to make it even more accessible to audiences. So really, what I'm saying is, if you're looking for a new game to play, with a fantastic story, compelling characters, and a rich world, look no further than the city of Midgar. Despite my initial misgivings, Final Fantasy VII exceeded my expectations in almost every way. Go give it a try. Thanks for stopping by to watch. If you've played the remake, give me your opinion on it in the comments. If you haven't, what are you doing watching me? I'll see you all next time.